Viewers, 24th of February 2022 is when President Putin announced his special military operation against Ukraine. It's now unsure as to how long this will go on. Ukraine is now unsure it can rely any longer on its staunchest ally, the U.S., as its exhausted troops that are fighting to hold the ground against, well, what one may say, unrelenting advances of Russia. Remember, it's been 3 years since the onslaught has gone on. In that time period, a lot of territory has in fact been lost by Ukraine to Russia. It did claw back some of it. It gained and made advances deep inside the Russian territory. And in these 3 years, there are some three defining moments that happened in this war. One was the Americans allowed under President Biden to use their weapons deep inside the Russian territory by Ukraine, something that didn't happen till now. The other key aspect of this war was that there were hired mercenaries who came into the picture. Soldiers from North Korea, soldiers all the way from Africa were fighting this war where they had absolutely no clue about, let alone any ideological moorings whatsoever. This was a war that pretty much divided the world. And of course, there were two sides to it. Russia had all along said that it's because Ukraine wanted to enter NATO, it's because there were deep advances being made very close to its territory that it had to defend itself. Ukraine, on the other hand, said, well, it's an independent country and has the right to decide for itself whether it should be in NATO or not. And in the midst of all this, Europe changed forever. You had countries like Finland, Denmark, Sweden, which were known for being absolutely independent in their opinion, finally take stances. But what has happened in this last 3 years is there's been a change of guard in the US, and with that, a change of position. But before we get any of that, I want to play out this report that tells the viewers what really happened, and then we get you voices on ground from Russia and Ukraine, and then we move ahead. But first up, that report.
A dictator without elections. He's not going to have a country left. Got to move.
3 years into the war, Ukraine's fight has taken a dark turn. Zelensky, once a symbol of resistance, celebrated by the West, is now under attack. President Donald Trump's return to the White House has upended everything. The U.S., once Kyiv's staunch ally, has turned its back, signaling a potential shift towards Russia, once a global pariah. Trump's America First mantra, now focused on ending the war, has ignited chaos.
He refuses to have elections. It's low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? It's hard to be high. Somebody said, oh, no, his polls are good. Give me a break. Every city is being demolished. They look like a demolition site, every single one of them. And the only thing he was really good at was playing Joe Biden like a fiddle. He played him like a fiddle. That's an expression we use, Yasser, to say that he's pretty easy. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast.
Президент Трамп з великою повагою до нього відносимося як до лідера народу, який ми дуже поважаємо, американський народ, який нас постійно підтримує. На жаль, живе в цьому дезінформаційному просторі.
Europe's once solid backing of Ukraine is now a distant memory. Leaders like German Chancellor Scholz and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer are sidelined, leaving NATO fractured and vulnerable. Zelensky's position crumbling. Internal corruption scandals, fading NATO hopes, and the US retreating have left Zelensky in a desperate fight. The war's toll devastating. Cities reduced to rubble, civilians caught in the chaos, and international fighters on both sides, further complicating the battlefield. As Russia pushes forward, the question isn't if Ukraine can hold, it's how long can it last. With Russian advances and relentless missile strikes, the future is uncertain, and the death toll continues to rise. The world watches, but will it be too late to stop the bleeding?
Okay, on the eve of the third anniversary of the war, there have been fresh shelling that's taken place. And let's get in both Dasha Chernyshova, who's joining me from Moscow, as well as Stuart Smith, who's joining me from Kyiv, to understand what's really happening on ground. Dasha, let me start with you. There's been very important commentary that's come in from Moscow saying they don't want quick fixes, they want a long-term solution. Tell us what's the mood like on ground in Moscow on the third anniversary of what was essentially a military operation.
Yes, indeed, among the Russian establishment, the politicians, there is a very clear understanding that time for the negotiations is here and those talks are now beginning, but also the outcome of those talks is quite uncertain. What Moscow is pushing for is to address the so-called root causes of this conflict in Ukraine. And with regard to that, the Russian officials have explained many times that this is the stance of Ukraine when it comes to any sort of military blocks. So Russia is concerned about any possibility of Ukraine being further dragged into the NATO orbit, and Moscow wants this issue to be addressed and some sort of legal guarantees that would prevent that from happening. Another thing that we can certainly understand from the Russian side is that in the negotiations they had with the American side last week in Saudi Arabia, they have not heard any plan from the Trump administration with regards to the Ukraine settlement. So this is still the work to be done. The Russian Foreign Minister, Deputy Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has said on Monday that any ceasefire to the conflict in Ukraine would not be a guarantee of this conflict not erupting once again. So they do want to make sure that there is the lasting solution worked out, that this is ironclad, that this is legally binding, and that will be preventing this conflict from erupting once again, because the fear in Moscow is that certainly these conflicts that is so close to the Russian borders will not be fixed in the manner that will provide for any sort of lasting solution. So this is the sentiment among the Russian elites. Speaking about the Russian population, you can definitely see another tendency. There is the overwhelming desire for the end of this conflict.
Okay.
No matter who you ask, whether those who support the conflict, whether those who disapprove of the start of this operation, the vast majority of Russians would be seeking an end to the conflict and the start of the negotiations.
Indeed. Let me now come to you, Stuart. The world has, or at least the main world leaders, those from Europe, have come to Kyiv. They are, of course, standing with Ukraine in solidarity. But much of Europe doesn't really have a solution right now for this conflict, does it?
That's right, and it's what's meant the last 3 years is something that President Zelensky said while he supports the efforts of Europe and the United States under the Joe Biden administration. There was never a clear strategy about how to end this. Now there is a strategy being proposed in a sense from Donald Trump, which is to at least talk with Russia and try to come to some sort of agreement. But in the wake of that, Ukraine is terrified that that could mean it ends up having to concede a huge amount to Russia and also therefore would also end up making the rest of Europe more vulnerable to any future incursion. So what does Ukraine want? It wants security guarantees, and it means not just legally binding agreements or reassurances from Moscow or Washington, but something physical in Ukraine that would prevent military action taking place again. Now, President Zelensky still says the most cost-efficient way to that end is NATO membership for Ukraine. But with Russia being quite clear on that not happening, and Zelensky realizing that neither the Americans nor the Europeans ever really wanted that to happen either, he's asking for peacekeeping forces in Ukraine from both the United States and Europe. And that's hard right now because the United States says it doesn't want to provide any peacekeepers on the territory of Ukraine. So UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron in Washington this week to try to convince Donald Trump that as long as Europe puts up some troops, then the Americans should as well, as part of any ceasefire agreement. But still really early stages, everyone recognises into these talks, and it's still not clear whether Moscow is seriously considering peace or not, considering, as you said, that it has managed to make advances over the past 3 years. Last year alone, 4 times the size of Kyiv in terms of territory was taken, and Ukraine is struggling to push back Russian forces still, though that advance is creeping.
Indeed. And Dasha, which brings me to ask you this, that while on one end Europe may not have a solution, voices within the American establishment are also saying that what they want from President Trump is a very clear guarantee as well, that, you know, when an agreement is signed, he will not go back on it. something that happened in 2014 after Crimea?
Well, in Russia, there is the understanding that there will have to be some sort of arrangement that will be using the balance of interest. And that's, again, according to the Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. But with that said, we have so far heard only what Russia is demanding, what Russia is not ready, that Russia is not ready to concede any territory to the Ukrainian side, that it wants security guarantees, that it wants demilitarized Ukraine, neutral Ukraine, but no word with regard to what Russia could be given in exchange if we are talking about any possible negotiations, because that is, according to political analysts, the essence of talks. But at the same time, the very clear picture that we are getting from Moscow is that this is a very early stage of those talks, and all of the components are yet to be put together. When we speak about this conflict in Ukraine, Russia has been saying that the security architecture in Europe has crippled. So this solution for Ukraine should also be part of a wider deal for the European security. Obviously, if you ask the Russian businesses, they would like to see some sanctions relief as well. But if you talk to the Russian authorities, they would all say that Russia can deal and can live even under those sanctions, once again stressing that the Russian economy has been showing not only the signs of resilience, but also the growth of over 4% over the course of the past years. So not only in Russia, there is a sense that Russia can go on with this conflict, and it is the desire on the Western side to bring this conflict to an end that is needed.
Okay, so appreciate Dasha and Stuart for joining me.